Hi everyone, today we will be mixing it up a little bit and we'll be taking a look at two downhill biking games for the Xbox Series X, Descenders and Lonely Mountains Downhill. Both of these games take some refreshing chances on the often saturated extreme biking video game market, so let's take a closer look. Let me start by saying the core concept of both Descenders and Lonely Mountains Downhill are the exact same. Ride a bike down a mountain relatively quickly along a winding path while overcoming obstacles along the way, and getting critiqued for how well you do so at the end. This is pretty much where the similarities between the games come to an end if you couldn't tell already. Visually is where the differences between these games are initially the most striking. Descenders opts for a more familiar, behind-the-bike view of your rider as you traverse realistic-looking, albeit sometimes absurd, environments. In Lonely Mountains, the game opts for a locked camera, almost isometric view of the rider and the mountain with a more cartoony aesthetic. While the different environments in Descenders end up being pretty awesome, there are at least 8 different themes to discover. The toy box-like creativity of Lonely Mountains as it plays with blurs and focus is beautifully executed. Both styles, though, fit their games nicely, but I came away slightly more impressed with the original look of Lonely Mountains. In terms of how they play, Descenders pits your rider along a series of procedurally generated levels, creating a roguelike experience with the goal of getting as far as you can before you run out of lives. After finishing a ride, you will select the next race, only knowing the steepness, curviness, and stunt rating, but the path of the course is again randomly generated. Your goal is to make your way to the boss level to advance the game to the next environment. You earn additional lives along the way by completing challenges and add crew members that give you help, like widening the path of the course or improving the handling of your bike. The game plays as fast or as slow as you want. Sometimes you'll have optional goals like finishing in 40 seconds or never pressing the brake, but other times it may be something simple like completing 2 backflips. There are also no penalties for veering off course, only for crashing, where the harder you crash, the more lives you can potentially lose at once. Staying true to the roguelike approach, once you run out of lives, you must start your career over from scratch, but after several runs you'll be able to pick different starting points, such as in the forest or desert versus the highlands, which help to keep the experience fresh and less punishing. Lonely Mountains is much more simpler in its approach. It's all about how fast you can get from the top of the mountain to the bottom. Most races have several checkpoints, which is where you'll reset your rider if you crash or fall off the mountain. The game challenges players to get from one to the next as quickly as possible and is as few crashes as possible. Unlike Descenders, the penalty for crashing is much more lax, and the main focus is simply getting fast times between checkpoints. Instead of resetting a career run that just took you half an hour to get through, you simply reset a few seconds to the previous checkpoint. That's a good thing though, as a single run down a mountain could have you crashing tens or even hundreds of times. This progression concept is where the feel of both of the games certainly differ the most. Between the two games, Descenders has the more complicated control scheme. In addition to controlling the bike, you also control the weight of your rider, allowing you to pull off slides, whips, and tricks. The game is very much pick up and play, but quickly becomes more technical as the environments become more difficult, or when you start trying to navigate obstacles and pull off tricks. Lonely Mountains has a much simpler control scheme, as the only other button besides turn, brake, and accelerate is a recharging sprint meter for unlimited but timely use to help improve your course times. The tracks themselves also have some pretty obvious differences which lead to a completely different feel. Again, Descenders is unique in the tracks are randomly generated, so you will never have the same run twice. You will see the same various assets from race to race, but it does mix them up enough to keep it feeling fresh. You can also just barrel down the mountain any way you can if you really wanted to. Lonely Mountains has set paths to ride along, but there are also constant branching paths, shortcuts, and hidden ways to shave off precious seconds, and is a more technical challenge, at least at first. Outside of the main career modes for each game, they are somewhat similar in their surrounding distractions, albeit a few more options to explore in Descenders, which I understand have been added post-launch. Descenders has both multiplayer a free riding mode with special courses, and a daily challenge mode which gives you one attempt to set a high score. In all the modes, you will earn rep to unlock the second career mode and other items for your rider. Lonely Mountains is all about unlocking all the various tracks among the 4 mountains and seeing where you rank. Literally every checkpoint of every race has its own leaderboard for instant feedback on your times and whether or not you set your own personal record. There are a few different bikes to unlock and some cosmetic items, as well as a daily challenge mode similar to Descenders. Descenders scores an 82% and Lonely Mountains Downhill scores an 83%. These are both great games that provide different but refreshing gameplay experiences in a genre that has previously grown quite stale. Ultimately, I felt like Descenders had some higher highs, with some faster and more exhilarating moments, was easier to pick up and play, and a better game to simply just zone out to. But on the other hand, Lonely Mountains Downhill is a more focused and streamlined experience surrounded by an equally original art style that ultimately felt a little more rewarding in the end, which is pretty impressive for a game that got its start on Kickstarter. Despite scoring a little bit differently, I don't think one game is necessarily better than the other, and depending on your own personal preferences and style of gaming, there is certainly enjoyment to be found in either of them.